Meandering northward through Addison County, Dead Creek empties into Otter Creek and eventually into Lake Champlain. Nearly 3,000 acres of the 50-square-mile basin is owned by the state of Vermont and managed by the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Dead Creek has some really unique natural habitats with the mountains on both sides, so it's just a natural migration corridor for a lot of birds. Shorebirds, raptors, waterfowl, they all come through here.
Dead Creek has everything the migrating birds need. It has shelter, it has food. It's right on the flyway, so it's an ideal bed and breakfast for them as they're making their journeys.
If you're a bird watcher, this is one of those areas that bird watchers of the state of Vermont come through.
One memory that is really dear to me was it was a clear sky with thousands of stars, and I just stood in this one spot. I heard 4 great horned owls all calling, and as it got light, more and more birds started singing around me. I was out here in this special place, and I had all these experiences that were unexpected.
Recognizing that Dead Creek could be an important resource for waterfowl and other wildlife, the state began purchasing land in the 1940s for conservation. Historically, Dead Creek was a cyclical stream, and its variable water levels were not ideal nesting habitat for waterfowl. During the next 10 years, Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife built 16 structures to control the creek's water levels.
We have some pretty unique habitats. We have the wetlands that we can manage. We can actually regulate water levels to try to manage for more soil units. We can manage for mudflats, for shorebirds, emergent aquatic vegetation to provide spring and summer habitat for breeding and nesting.
Bob Fuller, the first biologist at Dead Creek, was instrumental in its development and conducted extensive research.
He did a lot of vegetation plot samples to determine what the impact was of impounding these areas and the changes that occurred in the vegetation, as well as the wildlife responses to it.
After the impoundments were put in and they had water there the year round, it just exploded with a muskrat population.
Through the issuing permits, they could put as much pressure as they wanted to on muskrats or beaver or whatever that might be causing problems with drilling holes in the dikes.
Once the muskrat population stabilized, the program was disbanded and Dead Creek was opened to normal regulated trapping. Bob Fuller kept a flock of captive ducks at Dead Creek purely for the public to enjoy. In 1956, he established a captive flock of Canada geese to develop a resident population.
Bob went down to Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge in Delaware and live trapped some geese. Brought them up here. Pinion them means remove the wrist joint on one wing to make them flightless, and kept them in a 70-acre enclosure. And in the wintertime, we'd bring them into the barn because they couldn't fly.
We'd have to herd them into there, and then we fed them and watered them, and we were kind of stumbling along to get an artificial nesting site. And in the creek, we used rafts, styrofoam underneath. Then we'd have to go pull them in on shore through the winter. They worked good, but it was just a time-consuming thing, you know. So then we started erecting poles and putting a tub above water level like they are today. Gee, they jumped right on those. The birds would pair up with a wild bird. Then when we come to put them in the barn, the wild bird didn't like that, so it would take off. But you should have seen that wild bird react when it came back in the spring and found its mate here, you know. You talk about 2 teenagers. There was an awful lot of neck hooking and chatting. Oh, they were so glad to see one another, you know. Of course, they always came back to their home area, which was here.
They were attracted here by the impounded wetlands, but also because of the agriculture around it.
To monitor the goose population, an annual Goose Roundup was started in the late 1970s.
We spread out individually around the pond and slowly encircle the birds and push them up onto what we call our Roundup pasture.
Over the years, it became a big event where we would round up all the geese during a period when the adults were flightless and the young were still too young to fly.
After the geese are corralled into an enclosure, the birds are banded, sexed, and released.
81 is a local male.
This tradition continues today with the public invited to participate.
We are banding the geese, and it really is just to see who's coming back each year, how many. And I think it's very exciting. I've been coming since I was a little girl. It's just fun to get out and see wildlife up close.
Banding other waterfowl is not as easy.
And when it comes to banding ducks, you don't have the ability to round them up like you do geese when they're flightless. Initially, banding operations involved bait traps, big cage traps with funnels, and they were baited with corn.
The baited cage traps were replaced by cannon or rocket nets. When the rocket was launched, the net would cover the flock.
I think there's a banded black duck there somewhere.
The idea here was you could capture a lot of birds with one shot. Injury rate or mortality rate of using cannon nets was much lower than cage traps.
The goose population flourished, and captive flocks, no longer needed, were discontinued. Large numbers of snow geese began using the refuge, and several thousand Canada geese were stopping at Dead Creek during their fall migration.
We realized that what we needed was lands that we could set aside as refuge.
In 1976, the 420-acre Jerome Farm was purchased and is the basis for the refuge. Lease agreements were made with neighboring farmers to designate portions of their farm as goose management areas. 40 years later, Fuller shared the successful results of his pioneering program.
Fuller says the gathering here is the greatest concentration of snow geese anywhere in the Northeast.
It's become a tradition for them to stop over in this area. It started with a population of Canada geese that the Fish and Wildlife Department established here.
They come into the refuge, use the refuge as a resting area, and from there disperse out into the agricultural fields. These agricultural fields are really important. If they weren't here, the birds would just probably book right on through.
To address property damaged in the leased areas, the department started a controlled goose hunting program.
The purpose of the hunting program was to provide some quality public goose hunting opportunities by regulating the hunting pressure, not hunting every day, but only hunting certain days and mornings only. That would give the birds an opportunity to come back and feed every afternoon. We use hunting as a tool to disperse birds off of vulnerable hayfields that they could do damage.
Today, fewer migrant geese use the area, so the controlled hunts have been reduced. The land is managed in other ways. Moist soil management involves making food sources available to wildlife with water level changes. In the refuge, a buckwheat pond is plowed and seeded in early summer. When the plants have produced seeds in the fall, the area is flooded, providing an ideal feeding location for migratory waterfowl.
Moist soil plants are prolific seed producers, and when you put water back on those moist soil plants, you create a really outstanding feeding area for waterfowl and for other water birds too. Stems provide a substrate for invertebrate organisms. In the spring, when they're flooded, they're a real source of protein for birds that are coming back to a nest.
Support for habitat conservation and management comes from Vermont sales of both the habitat and duck stamps. These funds enable the state to leverage federal dollars from a tax on hunting and fishing gear. In the fall, Dead Creek provides some great duck hunting opportunities.
You get to see many other types of wildlife while you're hunting for ducks. It's just something I really enjoy. I think it's important to try to bring the next generations along. I've taken my granddaughter Addison. They look like they're moving slow, but they're not.
Yeah, and that word, I bet it's going at least 30.
Think so?
Dead Creek is really fun. There's a bunch of different places that you could go to. You always find something new that you can look at, or just listening to all the different types of sounds.
It's such a microcosm of different wildlife.
Hunting with my grandfather is really fun. We always joke around. It's not very serious. It doesn't matter if you get a duck, it's just spending time with him. But if you do get a duck, it's just a topping on top of the ice cream sundae.
Dead Creek Wildlife Management has grown over the years and is still focused on Bob Fuller's foundation of ongoing research. Researchers and the community are welcomed into its natural classroom.
Not happy to see us. Sitting on 14 eggs.
Outreach and education have always been a central part of Dead Creek's mission. There are classes for all ages.
There's a bone right there.
School groups participate in managing habitat for waterfowl and wetland restoration. And of course, the bird watching at Dead Creek is unparalleled.
This is a tree swallow, the one flying around in circles.
Right here? I thoroughly enjoy bringing my grandchildren here to Dead Creek because we always see something new and exciting and different.
I started keeping a bird list, and right now I have about 170 birds on that list. And it's just been like 1 or 2 years.
For those who want to get up close and personal,
I'm pretty sure that's a cedar waxworm.
Yeah.
MAPS, Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship, welcomes bird banding volunteers.
Second year.
The data is shared nationally to monitor bird survivorship. In the autumn, when migrating geese fill the skies, Dead Creek celebrates its annual Dead Creek Wildlife Day.
You got it!
The day-long event has dozens of workshops and demonstrations to educate and entertain the whole family.
And it's a collaboration between Forest Parks and Recreation, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, Otter Creek Audubon. Kids have the opportunity to try out new skills. It connects people to fish and wildlife resources.
Today, Dead Creek Wildlife Management area stretches across 3,000 acres and supports 250 species of birds, reptiles, and amphibians. The contained 650-acre refuge is a much-needed resting area for migrating geese and is off-limits to visitors. But the viewing area offers some tremendous sights of migrating Canada and snow geese.
Waterfowl that's here, especially in the fall migration, is a sight to behold for anybody.
The first time I saw the geese, one of the fields was just covered with what looked like snow. Those were really cool. There's thousands and thousands.
One of the nicest things about living on the Dead Creek Wildlife Management area, all the interesting people that you meet. All these people enrich your life. Dead Creek is a really unique place. It's an example of a real mosaic of different habitats, agricultural land, wetlands, woodlands, and it's really rich in wildlife and fisheries and natural communities. And we're losing these, and it's really important to conserve these so that we have these places where people can come and hunt, fish, walk, and bird watch. If we lose some of these areas, you lose them for good. You don't get them back.
That was cool.